There is a road called the Dixie Highway in Michigan. There is another one in Ohio. There are more in Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, and Florida. Dozens of them, some 4 lanes wide, some gravel, some ending at a cul-de-sac behind a shopping center. None of them connect. Drive one to its end and you will not find the next. Most are labeled Old Dixie Highway, which is the kind of name a place gets when the new version has moved somewhere else. Except in this case, there is no new version. There is nothing to be old in relation to. At its peak, this was a single organization controlling roughly 5,186 miles of road across 10 states. The largest coordinated highway system in the United States, larger than the transcontinental route everyone remembers, and it was assembled in barely a decade by men who had no legal authority to build anything. Then, in 1927, at the moment of its greatest reach, the people who ran it voted to dissolve it. Not bankruptcy, not scandal, a vote. An empire does not usually end that way. Empires are conquered, or they rot. This one was disbanded by its own founders while it was still growing, and within 30 years the towns it made rich were dying, and its name had shattered into fragments scattered across a third of the country. The question is not how the Dixie Highway was built. The question is what it was actually for, because whatever that was, the highway achieved it, and the achievement is what killed it. The story begins with a man who could not see very well. Carl Graham Fisher was severely astigmatic, a bicycle shop owner from Indianapolis who dropped out of school at 12 and spent his adult life pursuing things that moved faster than he could safely follow. He raced bicycles. He raced cars. He once dropped a car off a roof for publicity and another time floated over Indianapolis in a balloon with an automobile hanging beneath it. The stunts obscured the fact that Fisher was, underneath, a very serious businessman. In 1904, he bought into a patent for compressed acetylene gas headlights. Before that, driving after sunset was close to suicide. His company, Presto Light, put a canister on the front of nearly every car in America, and in 1913 he sold it to Union Carbide for roughly $9 million. He had already spent some of the money on a 2.5-mile rectangle of crushed stone outside Indianapolis that killed enough people in its first year that he repaved it with 3.2 million bricks. The Indianapolis Motor Speedway was not built as a spectacle. Fisher built it as a laboratory so American manufacturers could test their machines instead of losing to Europeans. Here is the pattern already forming, and it is worth noticing early. Fisher never sold cars. He sold the conditions under which cars became useful: light, testing, and then, inevitably, roads. In 1912, he proposed a gravel highway from New York to San Francisco, funded by the automobile industry itself, and asked the car makers to contribute. Most of them did. Henry Ford did not. Ford's refusal was not cheapness. His argument was that if private businessmen built the roads, the public would never demand that the government do it. And the government was the only entity with the money to do it properly. He thought the whole approach was a distraction. Everyone involved considered this an eccentric position. Set it aside, it will return. The Lincoln Highway made Fisher the most famous road promoter in America, but by 1914 he had a more personal problem. Off the coast of a small Florida town, he had acquired a strip of mangrove swamp so worthless that its previous owner had failed twice to farm it. Fisher was dredging Biscayne Bay and pumping the bottom of it onto the land to make dry ground where none had existed. He was manufacturing real estate, and real estate is worth nothing without buyers. The buyers were in Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan, 1,000 miles north, in a part of the country where winter lasted 5 months. Between them and Fisher's new land lay the worst roads in the United States. Fisher's original idea was simple, and it was a straight line, Chicago to Miami. He announced it in 1914, and what followed was not enthusiasm. It was war. Every town along every possible route understood immediately what was at stake. A road that passed through your county meant hotels, garages, restaurants, freight, land values. A road that missed your county by 20 miles meant slow disappearance. Chambers of commerce sent delegations. Newspapers ran campaigns. Rival cities accused each other of bribery, and in at least one case, the accusations were probably true. In April 1915, the governors of the affected states met in Chattanooga to settle it. They could not. Every concession to one state enraged another. Tennessee wanted the road through its mountains. Georgia wanted its own corridor. Kentucky had two cities with equal claims. Michigan wanted the northern end extended hundreds of miles beyond any sensible starting point, up to the Straits of Mackinac. So the commission did something that had no precedent in American road building. It refused to choose. Instead of one line, the Dixie Highway would be built as two, an eastern division and a western division, running roughly parallel down the length of the country and joining again in Florida. Not a highway, a loop. 2,000 miles of road that began in the same place and ended in the same place, and in between, deliberately went two different ways so that nobody had to lose. It was a brilliant political solution. It was also, though nobody said so at the time, an admission that the organization had no power to say no. The name mattered as much as the shape. Dixie was chosen deliberately, 50 years after Appomattox, to sell the South to Northerners as a destination rather than a battlefield, and to sell Southerners on a project financed and promoted from Indianapolis and Detroit. Newspapers called it the road that would finally reunite the country. The reunion it described was a particular one between white Northerners and white Southerners, and the highway would carry that meaning south with everything else. The association had a route, a name, and 7 states. What it did not have was a single dollar with which to build a single mile. This is the part of the story that gets skipped, and it explains everything that followed. The Dixie Highway Association never built roads. It could not. It was a private booster organization with dues-paying members, letterhead, a magazine, and no legal authority whatsoever. What it did was designate. It drew a line on a map and announced that the counties along that line were now part of a national highway. Then it waited for those counties to pay, and they did. County after county passed bond issues, hundreds of thousands of dollars in places with a few thousand residents, because the alternative was watching the traffic go to the county next door. The association's real product was not asphalt. It was fear of exclusion, converted into local debt. The money bought materials, it rarely bought labor. In Georgia, convict leasing had been abolished in 1908, and the men who had been sold to private companies were transferred instead to county road gangs. The timing was not a coincidence anyone hid. The state had a surplus of prisoners, overwhelmingly black, sentenced under vagrancy and petty statutes designed to produce exactly that surplus, and it had suddenly acquired an enormous public works project that needed muscle and could not afford wages. Chain gangs cut the grades, broke the rock, and laid the surface across long stretches of the southern route. Florida used the same system. Photographs from the period were printed proudly in Good Roads publications. This was considered a modern solution. So the road that was marketed as national reconciliation was built in significant part by men who were unfree, in a system that existed because the war had ended in a way that left that possible. That detail matters, and not only morally. It explains the highway's physical shape. Because construction depended on whichever county could raise bonds and whichever county had labor, the route did not follow terrain or logic. It followed willingness to pay. It bent toward whoever wanted it most. A road built that way can be extended indefinitely, in any direction, forever. Remember that. In October 1915, Fisher assembled a caravan of automobiles in Indianapolis and drove south. The Hoosier Tour was not an expedition. It was an advertisement. The cars carried reporters. They got stuck, were photographed getting stuck, and were photographed being pulled free by farmers with mules. Every image an argument for why the road needed finishing. When they reached Miami, they were met like explorers. What happened next is one of the fastest transformations of a place in American history. Miami's population in 1910 was 5,471. By 1920, it was 29,571. By 1930, 110,637. The people came by car. They came in such numbers and with such little money that an entirely new social category had to invent a name for itself. In 1919, at a park in Tampa, motorists who slept in tents and cooked over campfires organized as the Tin Can Tourists. identifying members by a soldered can fixed to the radiator cap. They were mocked in the local press as freeloaders. They were also the leading edge of 100 million people who would eventually do the same thing with better equipment. And along 1,500 miles of road, a new economy assembled itself out of nothing to serve them. Not built by planners, built by whoever owned the land beside the pavement. Filling stations, cabin camps that became motor courts that became motels, fruit stands, alligator farms, snake pits, citrus groves that sold to tourists at 3 times wholesale. Every one of these was a private bet that traffic would continue. The land bet was the largest. By 1925, Miami had thousands of real estate salesmen working a market where lots changed hands multiple times in a week, and building permits had climbed from a few $1,000,000 a year to somewhere above 60 million. Fisher's mangrove swamp, dredged, filled, and renamed Miami Beach, was selling for prices that would have been absurd anywhere in America a decade earlier. He had built a road to deliver customers to land he owned, and it worked more completely than he had planned. But the traffic on the Dixie Highway was never only tourists, and the association had less control over what moved on its road than over anything else about it. In November 1915, 7 months after the governors met in Chattanooga, a group of men climbed Stone Mountain in Georgia and burned a cross, reviving the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan of the 1870s had been a local mounted phenomenon, limited by how far a horse could travel at night. The Klan of the 1920s became a national mass organization with millions of members, and it did so as an automotive movement. Motorcades, cross-country organizing tours, parades that arrived in a town by highway and left the same way. Indiana, the state where Fisher lived and where the Dixie Highway began, became one of the Klan's strongest, its organization reaching into the governor's office. A road is neutral. That is precisely the problem with roads. The same asphalt that let a family from Fort Wayne reach the ocean let anything else with an engine reach anywhere it wanted. For some travelers, the road was not open at all. Along hundreds of miles of the Dixie Highway, there were counties a black motorist could not safely stop in, and towns that enforced sundown rules with signs. In 1936, a postal worker named Victor Hugo Green began publishing a guide listing which establishments would serve black travelers. A book that existed because a national highway system had been built across a country that was not nationally accessible. And then the traffic reversed. The Dixie Highway had been designed to move Northerners south for the winter. What it ended up moving, in far greater numbers and permanently, were Southerners going north for work. Through the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, the corridors that carried Fisher's tourists to Florida carried families out of eastern Kentucky, Tennessee, and Alabama toward the factories of Cincinnati, Dayton, Detroit, and Chicago. Whole neighborhoods in those cities were populated by people from a handful of Appalachian counties, connected to home by a road built to sell them Florida sunshine. The highway's greatest demographic effect ran opposite to its purpose. Nobody designed that. Nobody could have stopped it. Meanwhile, the association itself was doing something quietly fatal. The loop had worked. That was the trouble. Once the association demonstrated that a town could be added to a national highway by asking loudly enough and paying, the requests never stopped. A branch to Louisville, a connector through Alabama, an alternate through the Carolinas, extensions in Ohio, Illinois, and Michigan. Every addition brought new dues-paying members and new local bond money, and every addition was easier to approve than to refuse. By 1927, the Dixie Highway was roughly 5,786 miles long. It ran through 10 states. It had multiple parallel branches, spurs, and alternates. And in some regions, it was possible to travel in opposite directions on the Dixie Highway simultaneously. At which point, a reasonable traveler had to ask a question the association could not answer. Which one is the Dixie Highway? There was no answer. There was no longer a route. There was a brand applied to a web, and the Dixie Highway was not alone in this. By the early 1920s, there were more than 200 named trail associations in the United States. The Jefferson Highway, the Bankhead, the Old Spanish Trail, the National Old Trails Road, each with its own colored bands painted on telephone poles, each charging towns for the privilege of inclusion, several overlapping on the same stretch of pavement. Some associations sold designations to towns nowhere near a sensible route. A few were outright frauds that collected dues and painted nothing. A driver crossing a state might pass poles carrying 5 different color codes for what was physically one road. The man who ended this was not an enemy of highways. He was the most effective road builder the country ever produced. Thomas H. McDonald became chief of the Bureau of Public Roads in 1919, an Iowa engineer of famous humorlessness who insisted on being addressed as chief and who regarded the booster associations as amateurs monetizing a public function. Federal money had begun flowing in 1916 and was substantially expanded in 1921, and McDonald controlled its distribution. In 1925, a joint board of federal and state engineers began designing something the trail associations had made necessary and could not themselves provide: a rational, uniform national system. Their solution was numbers. Even numbers running east-west, odd numbers north-south, a single shield, one designation per road, assigned by engineers rather than purchased by chambers of commerce. It was adopted in 1926. The Dixie Highway did not survive contact with it. Its various branches were divided among US 25, US 27, US 41, US 31, and others. No single number corresponded to it because it had long since stopped being a single thing. In 1927, the Dixie Highway Association dissolved itself. There was no longer anything for it to do. The states were building roads with federal money, the routes were marked by the government, and the entire mechanism the association existed to operate, persuading, designating, collecting dues, generating local bonds, had been replaced by engineers and appropriations. 14 years earlier, Henry Ford had declined to fund a private highway on the grounds that private highways would delay the public ones, and that the public ones were the only ones that mattered. He had been exactly right, and the associations had proved him right by working so well that they made themselves unnecessary. Their real product had never been roads. It had been demand for roads, and demand, once created, was collected by someone else. The collapse of Fishers, Florida came first, and fast. In 1925, the railroads embargoed freight into Miami. Too much construction material, too little capacity. Prices wobbled. Speculators who had bought lots on paper discovered they owed money on land they had never seen. In September 1926, a hurricane came ashore at Miami, with winds that flattened the city center, drove a storm surge across Miami Beach, and killed hundreds. Photographs of yachts sitting in the streets ran in newspapers in every city the Dixie Highway served. The land boom did not decline. It stopped. Fisher lost most of what he had. He had already sunk a fortune into building a second resort at Montauk on Long Island, a Miami Beach of the North, which the 1929 crash finished. He died in 1939, 65 years old, with an estate of about $50,000, having created 2 of the most valuable pieces of developed land in America and kept neither. But the towns along the road were fine, better than fine. For 30 more years, US 25 and US 41 and US 27 carried an ever-growing river of automobiles through the main streets of small places, and those places lived on it. One of them was Corbin, Kentucky, a rail and highway town on US 25, where in 1930, a man in his 40s who had failed at almost everything took over a filling station and started serving food to travelers at his own dining table. Harlan Sanders eventually had a motel and a restaurant seating more than 100, and a local reputation for chicken cooked in a pressure fryer. His entire business was one thing. He was standing between Michigan and Florida. Then Congress passed the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. The interstates were not built to serve towns. They were built to avoid them. Limited access, long, uninterrupted runs, exits every several miles. Interstate 75 was laid out to run roughly parallel to the old Dixie corridor from Michigan to Florida, and everywhere it went, it took the traffic off the older road and put it in a channel with no reason to slow down. Sanders learned that the new highway would bypass Corbin. He auctioned off the property, took his Social Security check, and at 65 began driving to restaurants across the country, selling the right to use his recipe. He rebuilt his business by abandoning the road that made it, and the franchise model he helped popularize became the thing that filled the interstate exits. The standardized chains that made the individual roadside businesses of the Dixie Highway obsolete everywhere at once. Along 1,000 miles, the same thing happened without the happy ending. Motor courts emptied, cafes closed, downtowns that had been built to face the highway found themselves facing nothing. 4 miles from an exit that had a gas station and a chain motel and no reason to send anyone into town. The road had made those places. It unmade them by moving. Go back to the fragments. They are still there in 10 states, disconnected. Dixie Highway in Michigan, Old Dixie Highway in Georgia, a 2-lane stretch in Florida beside a drainage canal. They survive under that name almost exclusively where they were bypassed. The sections that lost their traffic and therefore lost the number that replaced the name and were left with the old label because nobody needed to update the sign. The Dixie Highway exists today only where it failed, and the failures were never separate from the successes. It got built because it promised every town inclusion, and it dissolved because inclusion had no limit. It was financed by convincing counties to go into debt for a road they did not control, which meant its route followed money rather than geography. It proved so conclusively that Americans would drive long distances that the federal government took the entire enterprise away from the men who proved it. It was designed to carry Northerners toward Florida land, and it carried the Klan and the Great Migration's white Southern counterpart, and eventually the interstates that erased it. It made Carl Fisher's swamp into Miami Beach and left him with nothing, and made Corbin, Kentucky prosperous, and then took it back. In recent years, some of the remaining segments have been renamed. In 2015, the city of Riviera Beach, Florida, voted to rename its stretch of Old Dixie Highway after Barack Obama. Other counties have held the same debates about a name chosen in 1915 by businessmen in Indianapolis and Detroit as a marketing decision. What is being argued over in each case is a piece of a road that no longer goes anywhere, named for a system that dissolved itself in 1927, built by a man who wanted to sell beachfront lots and accidentally organized the largest private highway network in American history. It did not fall because it was defeated. It fell because it worked, and everything it accomplished was, by design, impossible to keep.